It started with an innocuous meow. The scruffy tabby cat, with patches of orange and brown across its matted fur, appeared on my front steps one night. I'd seen it lurking around the neighborhood for months, but no one seemed to claim it. With each passing day, it got bolder, sitting closer to the door, purring more insistently, as if it had made its choice and picked me as its person. One evening, I decided to adopt it, putting out food and setting up a cozy bed on the porch. For a few days, everything was normal, and the cat seemed harmless until it started bringing gifts. First, it was just small scraps of fabric, torn and muddy, left on my doormat each morning. I dismissed it as the cat's way of showing affection, even though the pieces were strange, often red or black, and looked deliberate, almost personal. Then I noticed something more disturbing. On the fourth morning, there was a tuft of hair, a human hair, soft and freshly cut, left by the door. My stomach tightened as I picked it up, holding it with the edge of a tissue. I scanned the street, hoping for some explanation. I convinced myself that maybe it had somehow come from another house, though that didn't quite add up. By the fifth day, the offerings had evolved. They were now accompanied by scraps of paper, seemingly torn from a notebook. The words were blurred, as if smeared by rain, yet one word appeared clearly on each piece. Remember. One evening, after another unsettling find, I noticed something attached to the cat's collar, which was worn and dusty, as if it had seen better days. A tiny, twisted note was tied to it with a piece of frayed twine. My fingers trembled as I unraveled the string and unfolded the paper. There, in cramped, almost childlike handwriting, were the words, "I've missed you." The words sent a chill down my spine. It felt targeted. Every inch of my skin prickled with a raw, uneasy fear. My thoughts raced as I stared at the cat, its unblinking eyes staring right back. Who could have put this note there? The cat had no owner, at least none that I knew of. And why would anyone write that to me? I tried to shake it off, attributing it to some cruel prank by neighborhood kids, but the next morning, I decided to dig a little deeper. I asked around, inquiring if anyone recognized the cat or knew where it might have come from. No one knew anything. The stray had been wandering the neighborhood for years, they said, always on its own. I reached out to animal control, hoping to learn more, and that's when I learned about the man who had once owned the cat. He'd been arrested 2 years prior for stalking several women in the area, following them, taking photos from the shadows, leaving cryptic messages. My mind flashed back to the note, my heart pounding with a sickening realization. Had this man picked me? I thought I was free from the disturbing gifts and eerie notes until that evening. My body was tense with a dread that pulsed with each heartbeat as I heard a soft scratching on my front door. There, on the steps, was the cat, looking up at me, its piercing gaze heavy with expectation. Tied to its collar was another note, this one clearer, the ink fresh. I tore it off, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I unfolded it. The words were simple, yet each one struck me with a paralyzing finality. See you soon. I slammed the door, locking it, my breath ragged and fast. The room around me felt smaller, every shadow stretching menacingly, every creak making my heart skip. Outside, I could hear the faint scrape of claws on the door, the persistent, eerie echo of a cat's relentless determination. I backed away, every nerve alert, listening for the footsteps I was almost certain were coming. I knew, deep in my bones, that I hadn't been chosen by the cat. I'd been chosen by someone else, and he was coming. The first night I saw it, I thought nothing of it. Just a shadow outside my window, some passerby drifting through the night under the flickering streetlights. I barely registered the silhouette, wrapped as I was in the blue glow of my computer screen. But then it came again, and again. By the fourth night, the shadow was a permanent fixture, standing beneath the brittle, dying elm at the edge of my yard, watching. The fifth night, it moved closer. From my bedroom window, I could see it clearly, a figure, disturbingly still, standing just beyond the reach of my porch light. Its head was cocked to the side, a shadowy imitation of a curious animal, except the curiosity seemed sinister. I strained to make out any features, but but it was dressed entirely in dark clothes, a black baseball cap pulled low, casting its face in deep, impenetrable shadow. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? There's a man outside my house. He wasn't trespassing, technically. He hadn't tried to approach me. Yet, a tight, gnawing dread clawed at my insides, urging me to do something, anything, to break the eerie spell of his presence. The sixth night, I noticed the outfit. It was the first thing that snapped me out of my haze of terror. His clothes, his posture, even his shoes, they mirrored mine exactly. Down to the way his shirt seemed to hang awkwardly off one shoulder, like he was wearing a size too big. I froze at the window, staring at this stranger who wore my clothes like a second skin, who tilted his head in that same peculiar way I had been doing unconsciously for years. My stomach twisted into knots of anxiety and nausea. Why was he dressed like me? I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt him there, an oppressive presence lurking just beyond the walls. I finally drifted off at dawn, the light of feeble comfort against the images clawing at my mind. When I awoke, my phone was blinking with a new message. Tonight, it'll be perfect. I dropped my phone, backing away from it as if it had come to life. I didn't recognize the number. There was no name, no hint of who had sent it. But the words throbbed in my mind, a chilling promise that something was coming. I spent the day pacing my house, every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind amplifying the fear that coiled tighter around me. I told myself it was just a prank, a cruel joke designed to rattle me. But the quiet hum of terror in the back of my mind wouldn't let go. Night fell, swallowing the sky in inky blackness, and as the hours dragged by, I felt the weight of dread pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. I didn't want to look, but a part of me, that sickening, masochistic urge to see, to know, dragged me back to the window. He was there, closer than ever. The brim of his cap was lifted just enough for me to glimpse his face, or what should have been his face. Instead, it was my face. My heart jackhammered in my chest, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. There was a sick, surreal quality to the sight, like looking into a warped mirror. His eyes, my eyes, stared back at me devoid of any spark, cold and glassy, as though my own soul had been hollowed out and put on display. Suddenly, his arm lifted, waving slowly, mockingly, a too perfect imitation of the awkward wave I gave neighbors I didn't want to speak to. My skin crawled as I realized he had studied me, watched me so closely he could replicate every smallest gesture. He was practicing to be me. In that horrifying moment of clarity, I understood what he'd meant in the message. Tonight, it'll be perfect. A realization hit me like ice water, sending a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. This figure, this stranger wearing my face, wasn't just a stalker. He was a replacement. I backed away, barely able to breathe, the walls pressing in as if the house itself had conspired to trap me. The floorboards creaked in the hallway. I didn't remember hearing them move before, but now, as the noise grew closer, my heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. I didn't dare look. I ran, barely managing to stumble out the back door, my feet skidding over wet grass as I darted toward the road. I risked one glance back. The figure was in my window, staring out from my bedroom, watching me with my own cold, empty eyes. The last thing I saw before disappearing down the street was him, locking my door behind him. Late nights at the office were nothing new. I'd grown used to the dim hum of fluorescent lights, the way the silence thickened in the corridors after hours. But what I never got used to was the walk back to my car in the parking garage. The echo of each step, the stale, damp air, the flickering lights that barely fought off the darkness. It made me tense, anxious in a way that settled like a weight in my stomach. The first time I saw the car, it was parked just a few spaces down from mine. Engine off, the driver's figure obscured in the shadows. At first, I barely noticed, but something about the stillness drew my attention. A person sat in the driver's seat, facing straight ahead, not moving, not even checking their phone. Just sitting, staring. I brushed it off as nothing. Maybe he was waiting for someone. I pulled out of my spot, and try to shake off the creeping unease that settled into my mind. The next night, it was the same car, same spot. Same figure still facing forward. A strange uneasiness wormed its way through me, but I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to late-night jitters. But each night, the car was there, always closer to mine, inching forward space by space as if creeping toward me. And each night, the driver sat there, unmoving, eyes fixed dead ahead, a statue shrouded in shadows. One evening, curiosity got the better of me, or maybe it was some twisted sense of bravery. I parked and sat in my car, the dark figure 2 spaces away, and waited. My pulse thrummed in my ears, every nerve screaming that I should just leave. But I sat, eyes trained on the shadowy driver, half expecting them to turn their head, to show me their face. But they didn't. They just sat there, motionless. I felt like a trespasser, as if I'd stumbled into someone else's ritual. The sensation of being watched, of being studied, gnawed at me until I couldn't bear it any longer. I sped out of the garage, breathless and shaken. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, faceless and unyielding, waiting for me in that eerie half-darkness. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, that people wait in their cars all the time, and I was just letting my imagination spiral. The next night, as I approached my car, a sharp chill stopped me dead in my tracks. The windows were fogged. From the inside, my breath caught, a cold stab of fear rooting me to the spot. I hadn't been gone that long, just an 8-hour shift. I hadn't left my windows down, hadn't spilled water or left anything that could have caused condensation. My keys were in my hand, my bag slung over my shoulder. But my car sat there, misted over from within like someone had been inside. Breathing, heart pounding, I unlocked the door and slipped into the driver's seat, half expecting to feel a presence lurking in the back. But there was nothing. The car was empty, the air stale and close, yet heavy with an unseen weight. I drove home in silence, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached. That night, I double-checked the locks, but sleep was a distant dream. Days went by with no sign of the car, no sign of the faceless figure, and I let myself believe it was over, that whoever it was had moved on. I let my guard down, began to forget, until a week later, when I returned to my car to find something resting on the hood. A small, delicate doll sat in the center of the hood, staring up at me with empty, glassy eyes. Its porcelain face was cracked, lips frozen in a twisted smile. But it wasn't the doll that terrified me. It was a recording device inside it. I lifted it cautiously, hands trembling, and pushed play. A familiar voice, my own, crackled through the tiny speaker. "Hello, I'm home." My blood ran cold. That was me, my voice, greeting my apartment in that automatic, thoughtless way I always did. The recording continued, a sickening, distorted echo of my routine. Every single night that week, my voice had been captured. The way I sighed, the rustle of my keys, even the sound of me setting down my bag. All of it preserved in horrifying detail. Someone had been listening, studying, every small sound of my life, captured and stored by a stranger who, night after night, had been following me home. I slammed the doll down on the concrete, my heart a chaotic mess of terror and anger. I didn't go to the police. What would I say? I just went home, locked every door, every window, every crack and crevice in my apartment. And then I sat in silence, every light blazing, waiting in my own home, listening to the creaks and groans around me. I still don't know who the driver was or why he chose me. But every time I hear the quiet tick of my locks, every time I listen to the faint hum of my refrigerator, I feel that same gnawing, cold presence, like I'm still being watched. The first email was easy to dismiss. Just a strange message from an untraceable address that popped into my inbox with the subject line, "Hey, it's been a while." The body of the message was short and casual, like someone catching up. "I see you're still making your morning coffee at 6:30 every day." Huh? Old habits die hard. I glanced at it, shrugged it off as spam, and moved on. But the next morning, there was another email waiting for me. and the morning after that. Each one had a new, specific detail about my day. The time I left for work, the detour I took around the construction site, the exact moment I came back home. By the fourth email, my skin prickled with unease. I scanned my apartment for anything out of place, any small item that felt strange or disturbed. But everything looked normal. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe it was some weird joke from an old friend. But that creeping paranoia took root in my mind, tightening each day as the emails grew more detailed, more unsettling. Then one night I got a message that was different. This one had no friendly tone, no subtle hints at familiarity. It was cold and precise. Tomorrow will be your last day if you don't change your schedule. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. The words were bare, final. I read them again, as if somehow reading them over and over would make them mean something different. My hands trembled as I clicked out of the email, but the words stayed burned in my mind. Change your schedule. Was it a threat? A warning? I wanted to believe it was some sick prank, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind told me otherwise. Someone knew my routines, my patterns, down to the smallest detail. It wasn't a prank. It was personal. The next morning, I woke up in a fog of fear and indecision. I was supposed to be at work by 8. I could leave now, just go on with my day and ignore the email, but every instinct screamed at me not to. So I stayed home. I paced my living room, my apartment suddenly too small, too silent. Minutes dragged by, stretching into hours, each tick of the clock grating against my nerves. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another email, a text, something, but nothing came. It was just afternoon when my phone buzzed with a news alert. My heart dropped as I opened it. In bold letters, the headline read, "Man attacked in morning ambush at local parking lot." I felt the room tilt, the floor seeming to drop away beneath me as I scrolled through the article. It described a man who was attacked just after 8 that morning, the same time I would have arrived at work. Witnesses reported a man waiting by the parking entrance, acting strangely, hiding his face in a hoodie and keeping his eyes fixed on the lot's entrance. The description matched me, or someone who looked a lot like me. My stomach twisted with a sick realization. Whoever this person was, they'd been watching me so closely they could imitate my every move. They'd learned everything, my routine, my clothes, the exact moment I'd enter the lot. And the attacker, they hadn't left a trace. No witnesses had seen him leave. No cameras had picked up where he'd gone. He'd slipped into the morning crowd as if he'd never been there at all. The emails had stopped. Not a single one came that day or the next. But that sense of being watched, of having my life studied by an invisible presence, it didn't leave. I started noticing things. My blinds slightly parted, the faint outline of footsteps in the hall where dust had settled. Each time, my pulse would spike, my throat tightening as if I were being choked by fear itself. 2 weeks passed, and I allowed myself to believe it was over. I tried to sink back into my life, to forget that feeling of someone's eyes constantly on me, until another email landed in my inbox. This one was just an image, taken from outside my apartment window, looking in at me as I stood in my kitchen, oblivious, half asleep with a mug in hand. The email subject line read, "Good decision. Keep it up." I dropped the phone, my whole body numb. Whoever it was hadn't gone away. They were still watching, still studying every part of my life. My apartment, my sanctuary, had been breached, not by a stranger, but by someone who knew me. Every movement, every glance, every small habit I'd ever had. Now, each morning, I glance around before I take a step outside. Each shadow holds a threat. Each stranger in the corner of I might be the one who knows everything about me. The emails come occasionally, every few weeks, as if to remind me that they're still out there, still waiting. A nudge, a tap on the shoulder to let me know they haven't forgotten. And now, I wonder if I'll ever be able to forget. The desk was old, with a faded walnut finish and drawers that groaned when I pulled them out. I found it at an estate sale, a steal for $20, and hauled it home without a second thought. It had this old-world charm, with iron handles and scratches that told stories of years gone by. The perfect spot for my laptop and paperwork. I didn't notice the sticker until the second day. It was tiny, a faded strip of paper tucked just beneath the bottom drawer, only visible if you look from a certain angle. Please check for hidden compartments. It read in neat, typewritten letters. A chill crept up my spine as I read it, an unexpected shiver from what should have been an innocent curiosity. I pulled the drawer out, carefully feeling around the edges, pressing against the wood, my fingers brushing over every inch of the surface. And there was a tiny seam, almost invisible, beneath the base. I pressed against it, and with a soft pop, a hidden compartment slid open, revealing a stack of Polaroid photos and several yellowed receipts, all crammed in as though hastily hidden. The first Polaroid was a picture of an empty street, gray and dull, with a single cracked lamppost in the center. A quick glance at the back revealed a date and a place. 6 months ago, a neighborhood only a few blocks from where I live now. My throat went dry, but I brushed it off. Coincidence, right? But as I sifted through the photos, my hands began to tremble. Each one showed a different place, familiar places. The corner store I visited on Sundays, the gas station down the road, the coffee shop with the broken neon sign. I felt something heavy settle in my stomach, a slow, dawning dread. Each place was a part of my daily life, my routine, and each photo was taken from the shadows, as though the photographer had been hiding, unseen. The receipts were no better. They listed random purchases, each scribbled with cryptic notes on the back. Notes that seemed to track my life in eerie, disjointed phrases. Follow same route. Stops for coffee 7:15. Arrives home 5:30 sharp. The date stretched back for months, documenting my every move with a precision that made my skin crawl. The last photo, though, was what made my breath hitch, my fingers stiffen, clutching the edge of the picture. It was my house, a snapshot of my front door, framed in the dim glow of my porch light. A scribbled message on the back sent a bolt of fear through me. Soon, I backed away from the desk, every instinct screaming at me to toss the pictures, to burn them, to get rid of the desk and pretend I'd never seen any of it. My heartbeat was a rapid, relentless drum, filling the silence with its suffocating beat. But I couldn't just walk away. I had to know. I decided to trace the locations to figure out who could have been watching me and why. I started at the first place on the list, a rundown bar on the outskirts of town. It was empty, quiet, the bartender barely glancing up as I walked in. But as I scanned the room, I felt that familiar prickling sensation, the one that tells you you're being watched. The other locations yielded nothing, just ordinary places where people went about their lives, oblivious to the strange terror that had lodged itself in mine. By the time I reached the last place, a gas station at the edge of town, where the fluorescent lights hummed faintly in the stillness, I was desperate for answers, any answers. I showed the clerk the Polaroids, hoping for some recognition, some hint of who had taken them. He squinted at the photos, a frown tugging at his mouth, before shaking his head. "You're not the first person to ask about those," he murmured, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "A couple of months ago, a guy came in asking the same questions. He looked, I don't know, desperate. I pressed for more, but the clerk only shook his head, unwilling or unable to give me anything else. I left, feeling as though I'd slipped even deeper into a mystery that had no end, no bottom. The weight of it pressed down on me, filling me with an inescapable sense of dread. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside sharpening my fear. The photos and receipts were stashed in a box in my closet, hidden as if by hiding them, I could keep myself safe. But in the early hours of the morning, just as I was finally drifting off, my phone buzzed. I squinted at the screen, heart pounding. It was a text from an unknown number. "Did you find the desk yet?" I stared at the screen, my mind reeling, every ounce of sleep chased away. The reality settled in, sinking deep into my bones. They weren't just watching me. They knew I was looking, knew I'd found their notes, their photos, their trail of breadcrumbs leading me deeper into a darkness I could no longer escape. As I sat there in the dim light of dawn, phone gripped tight in my hand, I knew one thing with stark clarity. I'd stumbled into someone else's obsession, and they weren't done with me yet. Moving into a new neighborhood had felt like the fresh start I needed. The air was crisp with autumn's early chill, the streets lined with old trees dropping golden leaves that crunched underfoot. It was a quiet, cozy suburb, the kind of place where neighbors nodded politely, kids rode their bikes, and everything seemed untouched by the noise of the world outside. But that sense of peace cracked almost immediately. It started with the neighbors. They looked at me strangely, their eyes a little too curious, their smiles just a touch too knowing. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't shake. They greeted me with a strange, unsettling familiarity. "Hi, Mitch," they'd say, or "Nice to see you again, Mitch." Only my name wasn't Mitch. At first, I brushed it off as a simple mistake. Maybe the previous tenant had looked like me, and they were confusing us. But when I corrected them, they only chuckled, an odd glint in their eyes, and said, "All right, Mitch, whatever you say." The first night, I lay in bed with the eerie feeling of having slipped into someone else's life. Every creak of the house sounded heavier. Every shadow seemed to shift, as if the walls were hiding secrets. I woke up more than once, certain I'd heard something, a faint, distant whisper, or the creak of a floorboard just outside my door. But each time I checked, I was alone. The following morning, my neighbor Karen, a middle-aged woman with frizzy hair and a permanent scowl, invited me over for coffee. I accepted, partly out of politeness and partly out of a desire to settle the strange feeling that had been creeping over me. Her house was a mirror of mine, same layout and design, but with mismatched furniture that seemed to have been thrown together without a second thought. She poured me coffee and sat across from me, folding her hands over the table, her eyes unwavering. "You know, Mitch," she began, her voice low and almost conspiratorial, "it's good to see you back here. We missed you." A cold, uneasy laugh bubbled up in my throat. "I think you have me confused with someone else. My name's not Mitch. I just moved here." She gave me a look that was both pitying and amused, as though indulging some childish joke. "You don't remember, do you?" She shook her head, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Well, it'll come back to you. It always does." I left, my stomach tight, my mind racing. I had no idea what she meant, but her words echoed in my head the rest of the day. Back at my house, I found myself pacing, glancing out the window, unable to shake the sense that something was horribly, horribly wrong. The walls around me felt like they were closing in, the familiarity of my things feeling somehow off. Almost like someone else had placed them here, in a way only slightly different from how I would have. That night, as I drifted into a restless sleep, I heard something. A muffled voice somewhere nearby calling out a name. My name, but not my name. "Mitch!" I sat up, every nerve alive with a raw, pulsing fear. The voice was faint, somewhere in the darkened corners of the house. I crept out of bed, my heartbeat so loud it drowned out the silence. The voice echoed again, faint but unmistakable, as if drifting from the walls themselves. "Mitch, come home!" I backed up, nearly tripping over my own feet, every instinct screaming to get out. As I turned to flee back to my room, I saw it. On the hallway wall, where my coat hung, a single piece of paper, old and yellowed, pinned by an ancient nail. I didn't remember putting it there. My breath hitched as I reached for it, pulling it free with shaking hands. It was a flyer, printed in faded ink, with a grainy photo in the center. My face stared back at me, though the picture seemed somehow different, older, worn by time. Above the picture was a single word, missing. I staggered back, the flyer slipping from my hands. The dates, the details, everything matched, but the person in the photo, it wasn't me. Not exactly. It was like looking at a ghost, a twisted version of myself. Someone who had walked these streets long before I'd ever stepped foot here. In a blind panic, I grabbed my phone, scrolling through messages, contacts, looking for any tether to reality. But when I glanced down, all my contacts were gone, replaced by one single name. Mitch! I backed into a corner, phone clutched tightly in my hands, my mind spinning as the silence pressed down on me. I was in someone else's life, someone else's home. The walls, the neighbors, the town itself had drawn me in, twisted me into the role of someone who had once been here, and was never meant to leave. I could hear it again, that faint whisper pressing in from the walls, the floors, the very air itself. "Mitch, we missed you." As I stood there, trembling, the terrible realization crept over me like a cold fog. I had moved into a place where the past wasn't just lingering. It was alive, waiting for me to remember a life I had never lived. The first message came late one night, a single sentence lighting up my phone screen just as I was about to fall asleep. "You left me." At first, I thought it was a wrong number, some text meant for someone else. I ignored it, brushed it off, and let myself drift off. But the next night, at exactly the same time, the message came again. "You left me." I stared at my phone, feeling a strange prickling sensation crawl up my spine. I didn't recognize the number, and the message was the same, word for word, as the night before. I tried to block the number, hoping that would be the end of it. But the following evening, my phone buzzed. This time it was a new number, the same message. "You left me." Irritation mixed with an inexplicable sense of unease, like I was being tugged into something I couldn't see, couldn't control. I responded with a simple, wrong number, hoping that would be the end of it. But the messages didn't stop. Every night, the same text arrived, sometimes from a different number, sometimes in a loop from blocked contacts, relentless and unchanging. Each time I read the words, a sick feeling pooled in my stomach, a creeping, insistent dread. It had been a week when the message changed. "I'm here now, Dad." The words hit me like a punch, a wave of nausea curling in my gut. I had no children, no family living close by. I was alone, had been for years. I dismissed it as some elaborate prank, though I couldn't imagine who would go to such lengths. Still, the messages had started to gnaw at my mind, the words echoing long after I read them. I tried to ignore it, try to go about my day, but that night the text came again. And this time, the message was different. "I'm in the house." My entire body went rigid. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, and I held the phone, staring at the words as though they might vanish if I willed them away. But they didn't. The letters stayed sharp and cold, a silent declaration in the dark. I checked every lock, every window, my heart thudding painfully as I moved through each room. There was no sign of anyone. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, telling myself it was just a trick, just words on a screen. But then, as I stood in my dimly lit hallway, my phone buzzed again. A new photo sent from the same number. It was my front door, taken from the outside, the light above casting an eerie glow over the stoop. The picture was recent. I could see the newspaper I'd picked up just hours before, lying where I'd left it. I felt my chest tighten, the air cold and sharp in my lungs. Whoever this was, they weren't just taunting me from a distance. They were close, so close they could have been right outside. Watching, I moved to the window, peering out into the empty street. Nothing. No one. Only the faint hum of the street lamp, casting an unsettling glow over my front yard. Another buzz. I'm in the basement now. My blood went cold. I hadn't been to the basement in weeks. It was just an unfinished space, concrete floors, a few boxes gathering dust. There was no reason for anyone to be down there, but my feet felt rooted in place, as if some unseen force held me back from checking. A war raged in my mind, every instinct screaming for me to run, to call the police, but something, morbid curiosity or paralyzing fear, kept me still. I unlocked my phone, hands shaking, and responded with a single word, "Who?" The reply came instantly. "It's me, Dad." I couldn't breathe. The words stared back at me, each one heavy with an unnameable horror. This wasn't possible. I didn't have a child. I hadn't left anyone behind, hadn't abandoned anyone, not that I knew of. The phone buzzed again, another photo. This time, it was the basement, a shot of the bare concrete floor, a single dusty light bulb casting an anemic glow over the space. And there, in the corner, lay a small, battered cell phone, just like mine. My mind reeled, grasping at fragments of memories, faces I couldn't quite remember, flashes of things that felt more like dreams than reality. I blinked, and the basement seemed to shift around me in my mind, morphing into something darker, something that held shadows of a past I hadn't allowed myself to remember. I knew then that I couldn't stay here, that whatever this was, whatever nightmare had attached itself to my life, it was coming from within the walls of my own home. Grabbing my keys, I bolted out of the front door, not looking back. As I fumbled with my phone, desperate to call for help, one last message buzzed on the screen. "You can't run, Dad. I'll be waiting." I drove for hours, the empty highway stretching endlessly before me, the only light my headlights cutting through the darkness. Each mile only deepened my sense of dread, an unshakable feeling that no matter how far I went, no matter how fast I ran, the messages would find me. And every night since then, they have. It was supposed to be just another corporate retreat. The company rented out an old lodge nestled in a remote mountain valley, the kind of place where cell service was non-existent, and the only sounds at night were the whispers of trees and the distant, hollow echo of the wind. The lodge was vast but cozy, with creaky wood floors, faded rugs, and ancient taxidermy staring down from the walls. A rustic charm that somehow felt both comforting and slightly unsettling. On the second evening, after a day of endless team-building exercises, we gathered in the main hall for dinner. Just as we sat down, the lights flickered, and the head of HR, a brisk woman named Claire, stood up, clinking her glass. "I have a surprise for everyone," she announced, her voice carrying through the room. "As part of our safety training, we'll be running a break-in drill. This is just an exercise, so please follow protocol. When the lights go out, you'll have 30 seconds to hide in the designated safe rooms. No talking, no phones, no lights." She smiled, her eyes glinting with a mixture of excitement and sternness. "Remember, it's only a drill." The lights dimmed, and a murmur of laughter and nervous anticipation filled the room. We were used to these corporate stunts, so most of us shrugged and went along with it. The lights shut off completely, plunging the room into darkness. A shiver of discomfort prickled over me as I shuffled toward my assigned safe room with a few others, our footsteps echoing in the pitch-black silence. We crowded into a small storage room, hushed and tense. The darkness seemed thicker than it should have been, wrapping around us like a damp, suffocating fog. I could barely make out the shadows of my co-workers, their breathing sharp and shallow. We were supposed to wait until the lights came back on, signaling the end of the drill. Minutes passed, stretching thin and taut. The silence thickened, the stillness broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. But then we heard it, footsteps, heavy and slow, coming from the hallway outside. Each step seemed to carry an ominous weight, as though the person wasn't in any hurry, savoring each footfall on the creaky floorboards. I felt a rush of unease, telling myself it was all part of the drill. Just someone from HR, maybe even Claire herself, walking around to keep up the act. But then came the voices, low, muffled, almost unintelligible. They were speaking in hushed tones, their words slipping beneath the door, twisting into something that made my skin crawl. I strained to hear, catching fragments, sharp edges of words that sounded wrong, alien. They were too calm, too precise, like they weren't part of the game, like they were there for something else entirely. Beside me, someone shifted nervously, their breath catching. I wanted to reassure them, but my own throat was tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, closer, stopping just outside our door. Whoever it was, they paused there, silent, waiting. I held my breath, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure it would give us away. Then the doorknob rattled. I froze, every muscle locked in place. The rattle turned into a slow, deliberate twist. Whoever was on the other side was testing it, as if they knew we were inside, as if they were savoring our fear. The knob jerked, then twisted again, harder this time. I could feel the terror in the room swelling, pressing down on us, stifling the air. And then finally it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was a silence thick with dread, charged with the weight of something wrong, something that went beyond any corporate exercise. The footsteps resumed, moving away from our door, echoing down the hallway. We waited, listening, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps faded, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. But the relief was short-lived. Somewhere down the hall, a door banged open, followed by a muffled scream that sliced through the silence, raw and desperate. Panic bloomed inside me, twisting with a horrible realization that this wasn't a drill. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal, no way to reach anyone outside the lodge. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick with the scent of must, and something darker, something metallic. Then more footsteps, this time moving faster, more purposeful. They weren't trying to pretend anymore. Doors opened and shut, heavy thuds echoing through the lodge as they moved from room to room, searching. I glanced at the faces around me, wide-eyed, pale, their expressions reflecting my own fear. We were trapped, no way out, no way to know who was out there or what they wanted. The minutes felt like hours, and all I could do was sit there, trembling, waiting for the inevitable, each sound in the hall tearing at my nerves, fraying them until all that was left was raw fear. The voices returned, louder now, closer, accompanied by the scrape of something metallic dragging along the walls. A whispered threat that seemed to seep into the room, filling every corner. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went silent. The lights flickered back on. The lodge was empty, the hallways quiet, but the doors hung open, a mess of paper strewn across the floors. No sign of the others, no sign of Claire or any of the team. We stumbled out, dazed, shaken. The lodge was still, as though whatever had happened had simply evaporated, leaving nothing but an eerie calm in its wake. But I knew, I could feel it deep inside, that something had been there, watching us, toying with us. They never found Claire, or any of the others, and I still don't know what I experienced that night. But every time I step into a quiet room, every time I hear footsteps that don't belong, I feel that same creeping dread, that knowledge that somewhere out there they're still behind me. The first thing I noticed missing was a faded blue hoodie, a simple, comfortable thing that I wore every weekend. I figured it must have gotten lost in the laundry, or maybe I'd left it at the gym. I shrugged it off, thinking it would turn up. But then over the next week, more items started disappearing. A baseball cap, a pair of worn jeans, my favorite black sneakers. It wasn't until I saw them again, somewhere I shouldn't have, that I realized something was deeply, horribly wrong. It started innocently enough, scrolling through my social media feed. There was a photo of a stranger wearing my hoodie, unmistakably mine, with a faint paint splatter near the cuff. A chill spread through me as I stared at the picture, trying to make sense of it. The person in the photo was in a coffee shop I recognized, one just down the street from my apartment. But it was the caption that sent a shiver down my spine. Just living my life, it read, tagged with my own name. My fingers hovered over the screen, heart racing as I clicked into the profile. It was completely empty, no friends, no photos except for this one post. I couldn't understand it, couldn't shake the feeling that somehow someone had slipped into my life, taking bits of it without my knowing. I thought about reporting it, but what would I even say? I decided to ignore it, hoping it would just disappear. But a few days later, the account posted another photo. This time, it was a picture of the stranger at a bar I frequented, wearing my baseball cap and the missing sneakers, with the same eerie caption, "Just living my life." The words twisted in my gut, a sickening feeling creeping over me. How could this person know the places I went, the clothes I wore? I tried to brush it off, convinced it was just someone playing a prank. But my mind wouldn't let go of the unease, the feeling that someone was watching, learning the most intimate details of my life. The photos kept coming, each one taken at a spot that was painfully familiar. The park where I went jogging every Thursday. The bookstore I loved to browse on lazy Sunday afternoons. Each time, the captions grew more unsettling. Just where I belong, living life as it should be. I became paranoid, watching for any signs of this stranger every time I stepped out. The world around me seemed to warp, each face in the crowd carrying a hint of something sinister, like they might all be hiding the stranger beneath their skin. I stopped going out, too rattled to enjoy the places that had once been part of my life. Then, one night, as I scrolled through my phone, the stranger posted again. This time, it was a picture of my own apartment building taken from the street below. They were close, right outside. My heart hammered in my chest, my hand trembling as I stared at the image. The caption was simple, but it was enough to drive my fear over the edge. Home sweet home. I bolted out of bed, throwing on my coat and grabbing my phone, intending to leave, to get away from whatever nightmare this had become. But as I reached for the door, I froze. My phone buzzed, and a new notification popped up on my screen. It was a live video from the stranger's account. I clicked on it, breath catching as the screen filled with a view of someone walking up my apartment steps. The camera jostled with each step, moving slowly, almost lazily, as though they knew exactly how this would end. They reached my door, the view tilting as they raised a hand, knocking 3 times. My blood ran cold as the sound of the knock echoed, both from my phone and in real life. They were there, right on the other side of the door. I backed away, dread curling in the pit of my stomach as the live feed continued. The camera moved lower, revealing a pair of feet clad in my missing sneakers. They were wearing the hoodie, the jeans, everything that had vanished from my apartment. I heard my own shaky breath fill the room, mingling with the steady sound of their breathing on the other side of the door. The video continued, the stranger's hand reaching toward the doorknob, gripping it, twisting it slowly. My heart raced as the knob turned, a soft, sinister creak that seemed to pierce the silence. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I knew I should run, but something held me in place, a strange paralysis as I watched the door begin to open. The live feed cut off, leaving me staring at the blank screen, just as the door in front of me swung open. There in my doorway stood the stranger. They were wearing my face, my clothes, my entire life draped around them like a costume. Their gaze met mine, and I saw something empty, something dark and hollow that seemed to stretch into infinity. They smiled, a twisted mirror of my own expression, and stepped inside, closing the door softly behind them. They took a step closer, and I backed away, every instinct screaming at me to do something, anything, but I couldn't. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick with a dread that suffocated every last rational thought. They reached out, touching my shoulder, a firm, possessive grip that sent shivers through my skin. "It's my life now," they whispered, voice soft but dripping with finality. And then they turned, walking past me, into my apartment, as though it had always been theirs. I tried to call out, to say something, to assert my presence, my identity, but my voice didn't come. I was left there, standing in the dim light, watching as they disappeared into the shadows of my own home, my own life. When I finally found the courage to step forward, to follow, the apartment was empty. It was as though they'd never been there. But the next day, I saw it. Another post on the stranger's account, a picture of my living room, captioned with one word that sent chills through my bones. It was a nondescript cardboard box, sealed with plain tape, left on my doorstep with no return address. My name was written across the top in thick black marker, and while it wasn't unusual for me to receive deliveries, something about this box made me hesitate. There was no indication of where it came from, no stamp or branding. Just my name, alone in stark letters. A sense of unease settled in my chest, but I pushed it aside, figuring it was just some mix-up or maybe an anonymous gift. I carried it inside, setting it on my kitchen table. When I sliced through the tape and opened the flaps, I felt my stomach drop. Inside were papers, stacks of them, neatly organized, filled with words in tiny, cramped handwriting. Each page was covered in meticulous detail, down to every inch of space, as if the writer had been compelled to record every single thought, no matter how small. I pulled out the first sheet and read. It was about me, my routines, written with a precision that felt clinical, detached. It described my morning ritual, my commute, even the little things I did absent-mindedly, like how I hummed when I washed dishes or cracked my knuckles before bed. My mind raced as I rifled through more pages, feeling the weight of my own life reduced to ink and paper. Every line felt like an invasion, each tiny detail documented with a cold, unsettling intensity. Whoever had written this had been watching me, studying me. I told myself it was a prank, some elaborate joke, but my gut told me otherwise. Each sentence crawled under my skin. The pages felt like a trap, one I'd stepped into without even knowing. At the bottom of each page was a single line: follow exactly, or else. I dropped the papers, my heart pounding. Follow what? Exactly? I didn't see any instructions or demands, just an endless catalog of my own life, as if I was meant to take this bizarre surveillance as some kind of guide. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left the house, I felt eyes on me, a prickle at the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. I kept the box in a cupboard, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of dread growing inside me. And then the messages started. Small notes left around my house, each one brief and cold, typed on scraps of paper and hidden where I would find them. The first one was in my kitchen, tucked inside my coffee cabinet. 7:15 a.m. sharp. That was the time I normally left for work. But the wording wasn't a simple suggestion, it was a command. I was being directed to follow my usual schedule, like they wanted me to perform my own life according to their script. I stared at the note, feeling a sick fear claw its way into my chest. Whoever was doing this wasn't satisfied with just watching me. They wanted me to play along. The next note appeared 2 days later, in my bathroom cabinet. Brush your teeth. Count to 20. I felt like a puppet, yanked around by invisible strings. My routines no longer felt like my own. Every ordinary action seemed tainted, twisted by the notes, as if each movement was something I had to get exactly right. The notes came more frequently, detailing each step of my day. They covered every aspect of my life in chilling, precise detail. Take the trash out at 6:30 p.m. with a gray hoodie on Wednesday. Use exactly 2 pumps of soap. They wanted me to follow each instruction, or there would be consequences. I started to panic, trying to break the routine to see what would happen. I left the house a few minutes late one morning, and the next note I found was in my car's glove compartment. Follow exactly, or else. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I was sure they'd been watching, recording every step, and now they were trying to warn me. Every time I deviated, I could feel them tightening their grip, demanding I return to the steps they had laid out for me. I went to the police, but what could I show them? A box of typed papers? Notes with vague threats? They treated me like I was imagining things, dismissed it as a prank, told me to change my locks and stay vigilant. But the next morning, as I sat at the breakfast table, my phone buzzed. I glanced down, and there, waiting in my inbox, was an email from an address I didn't recognize. It was a video. With my hand shaking, I pressed play, a grainy image appearing on the screen. It was a recording of me from just the night before, as I sat exactly where I was now, sipping coffee, reading a book. The camera angle was perfectly positioned, as though whoever had filmed it had been inside my house, watching me up close. The video ended, cutting to black, but there was a message at the bottom of the screen. You'll follow, or else. I backed away from the table, while rising in my throat, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I knew, with a certainty that made my legs shake, that there was no way out of this. Every step I took, every choice I made, was no longer my own. I had been reduced to a series of actions on a page, living a life that wasn't even mine anymore. From that day forward, I followed their schedule, a prisoner in my own life. Every action meticulously timed, every choice decided by someone I couldn't see, someone who had decided my life was theirs to control. And every so often, a new package arrives with new instructions. The worst part is, I don't know who they are or why they've chosen me. All I know is that I can't stop following, or else. Friends, please support my channel by subscribing and liking it. You are the best.